There was no apology. That is the detail that changes everything about how this case has to be understood. 3 sources familiar with the investigation confirmed it to NBC News this week after months of speculation about what that second note actually said. The people who took Nancy Guthrie sent a message admitting she was dead, and in that message there was no apology for taking her. There was something else instead. Regret. Specifically, regret over her passing. Not regret for the abduction. Not remorse for what they did to an 84-year-old woman in the middle of the night. Regret that she died, as though her death was a complication in their plan, rather than the direct and foreseeable result of what they had already done to her. Read that distinction again, because it is the entire story. Now stop here for a moment before we go further into the timeline. You just heard that the people who took Nancy Guthrie expressed regret over her death, but never apologized for taking her. What does that tell you about who they are? Does that sound like someone who panicked when a plan went wrong, or someone who never saw Nancy as a person to begin with, only as a means to something else? Tell us what you think in the comments. We read every one. This is the Case Ledger. If this is your first time here, we follow evidence. We don't protect powerful people. We don't move on until the case moves. Subscribe and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss what comes next in this one. Let's go back to the beginning of these notes, because the timeline matters enormously here. The first note arrived on February 2nd, 2026, one day after Nancy Guthrie was reported missing from her home in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona. It was sent to 3 media outlets through their online tip lines, 2 local television stations, and TMZ. The note demanded millions of dollars in Bitcoin for Nancy's safe return, and it contained something that should have told investigators immediately that whoever wrote it had been inside that house, or had access to information that only someone with direct knowledge of the scene could have had. The note specified that an Apple Watch with a white band was on the floor of Nancy's bedroom. The note specified that her back porch light was broken. Those are not details you guess. Those are not details that leak through a police scanner or a neighbor's gossip. Those are crime scene specifics, the kind of granular physical observation that comes from someone who was either present during the abduction or received a direct report from someone who was. The note was addressed specifically to Savannah Guthrie. It gave the family 4 days to pay, according to reporting from Airmail, or the kidnappers would no longer guarantee Nancy's safety. Investigators who reviewed the note assessed the level of specificity as significant enough to treat it as credible from the moment it arrived, a determination that shaped every decision that followed. The task force made a decision at that point that is now, nearly 5 months later, being re-examined as one of the most consequential choices of the entire investigation. Instead of attempting to pay the amount demanded or negotiating directly, investigators decided to try something called tickling the wire, sending a small test amount of cryptocurrency to the wallet address provided in the note with the goal of tracking the transaction if the kidnappers attempted to move or cash it. This is a recognized law enforcement technique. The logic behind it is sound in principle. Cryptocurrency transactions can sometimes be traced through blockchain analysis if the recipient interacts with the funds, potentially exposing an exchange account, an IP address, or a pattern that leads back to a real identity. The amount they sent was $152. $152. Against a ransom demand reported to be in the millions, investigators sent an amount so small that sources close to the case now say it was insufficient to produce the result they wanted. There was no engagement, no movement, no response of any kind. The wallet sat untouched, and, according to multiple reports, it remains untouched to this day, months later. No transaction, no activity, nothing. Whether a larger test amount would have produced a different outcome is a question that has now become central to the second guessing of those early decisions. Some investigators reportedly believed a more substantial gesture, something closer to what an anxious family might actually be expected to send in a moment of panic, could have prompted the kind of movement that blockchain analysts could have traced. Others maintain that any amount sent without full payment was always a long shot, and that $152 was a reasonable test precisely because it limited financial exposure if the note turned out to be a hoax. The strategy failed to produce a trackable lead either way. And 4 days after that first note, with the demanded payment never having been made and the wire-tickling tactic having produced nothing, the second note arrived. February 6, 2026. According to a person close to the case who spoke to the Daily Beast, the second note opened with what that source called an apology. But what NBC News and CBS News have now both separately confirmed through multiple independent sources is more specific and more disturbing than a general expression of regret. The note told the family that Nancy Guthrie had died. It said the senders did not mean for that to happen, and critically, it made no demand for money in exchange for the return of her body. No demand, no price, no negotiation for what remained of her. Investigators believe both notes came from the same person or group, and that both were sent from the same computer IP address. That detail matters because it eliminates the possibility that the second note was an opportunistic hoax layered on top of a real abduction, a stranger capitalizing on a tragedy that was already public. The forensic link between the two notes tells investigators that whoever wrote the first one, with its precise knowledge of the crime scene, is the same person or group who wrote the second one, confessing that Nancy was gone. Savannah Guthrie addressed this directly in an interview with NBC in March, months before the specific contents of the second note were made public. She said her family believes both notes are authentic. Not maybe, not possibly. Believes. A daughter, looking at the most painful piece of evidence to ever cross her path, made the determination that the people who sent those messages were telling the truth about what they had done to her mother. After the second note arrived, Savannah and her siblings, Annie and Cameron, recorded a 20-second video and posted it to Instagram. Savannah sat between her brother and sister, holding their hands. "We received your message, and we understand," she said. "We beg you now to return our mother to us so that we can celebrate with her. This is the only way we will have peace. And then, this is very valuable to us, and we will pay." A family begging the people who had just told them their mother was dead to bring her body home, offering to pay for something that, by the contents of the very note they were responding to, had not even been requested. The kidnappers asked for nothing in the second note. Savannah Guthrie offered everything anyway, because the alternative, silence, no response, nothing, was unthinkable to a family that did not yet have a body to bury, and still, to this day, does not have one. Now think about what the absence of a financial demand in that second note actually tells investigators about the people who sent it. A ransom note that asks for money, even after a death, is at least operating within a framework investigators understand. It is a transaction, however monstrous. It has a logic. Pay us, and you get something back. But a note that confirms a death and asks for nothing in return breaks that framework entirely. It suggests the senders no longer believed there was anything left to negotiate. It suggests they understood that whatever they had been planning, whatever the original framework of this abduction was supposed to be, had already collapsed by the time they sat down to write that second message. The expression of regret over her passing, without an apology for what was done to cause it, is the detail forensic psychologists and behavioral analysts will spend the most time on. It reflects a specific kind of thinking. It treats Nancy Guthrie's death as an unfortunate outcome of a plan, rather than the inevitable consequence of taking an 84-year-old woman with a pacemaker and a chronic heart condition from her home in the middle of the night. People who write notes like that are not processing what they did as murder. They are processing it as a mistake in execution, a variable that did not go the way they expected. This is the language pattern that criminal psychologists describe when analyzing offenders who minimize their own culpability while still acknowledging an outcome. The structure of the sentence matters as much as its content. "We did not mean for her to die" places the speaker as a passive observer of an event rather than an active participant in causing it. It is the language of someone explaining an accident, not confessing to a crime. And the fact that this language appears in a note written by the very people who orchestrated her abduction, who planned the entry, who disabled her camera, who administered a sedative to a frail elderly woman with a documented cardiac condition, suggests a profound disconnect between what they did and how they have chosen to describe it to themselves and to the world. That distinction has mattered enormously to how this investigation has been built. The pacemaker data recovered from Nancy's device already told investigators that she experienced a sudden, severe cardiac event at 1:47 in the morning, consistent with a quote terror, followed by a passive transport pattern and a pharmacological sedation signature in the final minutes before her monitoring signal was lost at 2:28. The note's language, that they didn't mean for her to die, is consistent with people who sedated an elderly woman with a known heart condition without fully understanding or without caring to understand what that combination of stress, sedation, and a fragile cardiac system would do to her body. They may not have intended a death. The evidence increasingly suggests they may not have cared enough to prevent one. CertIK, a Web3 security firm, published a report last month identifying the Nancy Guthrie case as an example of what the cybersecurity industry calls a wrench attack, a crime in which someone uses physical force, threats, or kidnapping specifically to gain access to a person's cryptocurrency holdings, rather than attempting to breach the digital security itself. The term comes from a webcomic that popularized the idea that no amount of encryption matters if someone is willing to threaten you with a wrench until you hand over your password. The report described Nancy as a proxy target, a vulnerable relative used as leverage against the actual intended target of the extortion, in this case, her daughter Savannah's wealth and public profile. The CertIK report cited the specific framework of the two notes, the initial high-dollar demand followed by collapse and silence, as consistent with a pattern they have tracked increasingly across cases involving public figures and their families. Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed to Fox News Digital that he had flagged the CertIK report to his investigation team, though he declined to discuss it further, citing the need to protect the integrity of the case. "It's not done because we got to keep it secret," he told KOLD. "It's done because we got to protect our case." If that framework is accurate, it reframes the entire sequence of events. This was not a kidnapping that went wrong because of bad luck. It was, according to this theory, a targeted financial crime against a specific category of victim fawn, the elderly relatives of wealthy or famous people, that has been documented increasingly in recent years as cryptocurrency makes extortion both more lucrative and more anonymous. And Nancy Guthrie, according to this theory, was never anything more than the mechanism through which her abductors hoped to reach money they believed her daughter could access. She was a means, not an end. That is the coldest possible interpretation of why an 84-year-old woman who tended her garden and went to church every Sunday and asked nothing of anyone was selected, surveilled, and taken from the one place she should have been completely safe. 5 months later, the wallet from that first ransom demand has never been touched. The $152 sent by investigators sits there, untouched, alongside whatever amount the kidnappers were originally hoping to receive before the plan collapsed. No one has claimed it. No one has moved it. It exists now as a kind of digital fossil, a record of a transaction that never happened, attached to a crime that did. The DNA recovered from Nancy's home, a mixed sample, a rootless hair, a glove found nearby, is still being analyzed at the FBI laboratory in Quantico. Retired FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer has publicly questioned why an enhanced image of the masked figure from the doorbell footage has not been released to the public after 4 months, suggesting investigators may already have an identity in mind and are simply building the case to support an arrest before making it public. Savannah Guthrie returned to the Today Show in April and has continued co-hosting since, missing only a handful of days. She goes to work, she delivers the news, and somewhere in a server room or an evidence locker in Tucson, Arizona, 2 notes sit as the closest thing this family has to a confession, one admitting an act, one admitting a consequence, and neither one ever saying the word that matters most. Sorry. The reward stands at $1.2 million. The DNA is still being processed. And the second note, the one that finally confirmed what this family had been fearing for months, asked for nothing in return, because by the time it was written, there was nothing left to ask for. 5 months ago, Nancy Guthrie was a woman who tended her garden, attended church every Sunday, and lived a quiet life in a home she had occupied for decades. Today, the most concrete piece of information her family has about what happened to her is contained in a message that confirms her death without explaining it, expresses regret without apologizing, and asks for nothing in a case that began with a demand for millions. Savannah Guthrie said she believes the notes are real. Investigators believe they came from the same source, and somewhere in Tucson, Arizona, or somewhere far beyond it, across a border that the evidence has suggested more than once might be relevant, the person or people who wrote those 2 messages have spent 5 months living with what they did and how they chose to describe it to themselves. We did not mean for her to die. That is not an apology. It has never been an apology. It is the language of people who have not yet decided that what they did to Nancy Guthrie requires one.